Hello, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, as always, we'd like to thank our executive producers, Tom McCool, Tony Turrin, Justus Abel, and Jeremy Marcoux. If you'd like to help support the show, you can check us out at patreon.com/historiesmost or send us an email at histories.most@gmail.com for any comments, feedback, or suggestions. Thanks so much, and now, on with the episode. When you imagine the Dark Ages, what do you think of? Due to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, society collapsing entirely, foreign invasions, linguistic and cultural erasure on a mass scale. But what if that wasn't what happened? And if that didn't happen, what did? In this new series, we will be taking a look at one of the most fascinating and mysterious periods of time, the 5th century in Britain, an era which has very few contemporary sources and where hard facts are hard to come by. Over the next few weeks, we'll be talking to multiple historians about this strange, perplexing age to hear their opinions and possibly help unravel some of the mysteries behind history's most puzzling century. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another very special episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and I'm delighted to say today we are joined by historian, archaeologist, and author of The First Kingdom, Britain in the Age of Arthur, Max Adams. Thank you for joining us, Max.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
The reason we're joined by Max today is because on History's Most, we're going to do something a bit different over the next few weeks. We're going to try and look in depth at one of the most confusing and difficult to understand periods in British history. We're going to mainly be looking at the 5th century AD. And the reason that it is so shrouded in mystery is because, to be frank, there are so many different versions of what happened during that time. This is what was, I guess, in the past referred to as the Dark Ages. It's also been called the Arthurian Age, or the Age of King Arthur. And the, if I can call it, traditional narrative is one of the departure of the Roman Empire, Britain falling into chaos, civilization collapsing, and Saxon invaders more or less wiping out the indigenous culture and replacing it with their own language, religion, and material culture. Now, the reason we're going to explore this period on History's Most is because over the last maybe 30 years or so, there has been a fascinating re-evaluation of our historical and archaeological understanding of this period. And we thought there was no one better than Max Adams to start this series because his recent book, The First Kingdom, I think one of the things it does very effectively is it tries to pull together loads of different studies by archaeologists, scholars, and historians, and tries to give us an up-to-date picture of where we are now in the historiography. So we're indebted to Max for coming on the show. I'd like to ask you, Max, first of all, before we get to this 4th century Dark Age, inverted commas, of mystery that we perhaps are only starting to put together now, what was late Roman Britain like? It seems to be a period with a lot of instability. There is a remarkable number of usurpers and rebellions that start in Roman Britain, which seems strange given how far from the centers of power it was. I mean, all the way back to Constantine the Great in the early 4th century, rises his standard rebellion in York, I believe. So could you paint us a picture then of late Roman Britain? And I guess it's 2 questions, isn't it? What was late Roman Britain like? And also, why so much kind of chaos?
Well, what was late Roman Britain like? I wish I knew. the, as always with this Dark Age period, we have this contradiction between the very few historical narratives that have come down to us, and the archaeology that people like me uncover, and they don't seem to marry very well. What we can say, I think, is that yes, Britain had a reputation for being a land fertile in usurpers, and I suppose in a way, in order to understand why Rome leaves, if indeed Rome as an institution does leave, is to ask why Rome came in the first place. And there's a certain amount of political vanity in holding Britain. It's an imperial trophy. Caesar thought about it, Claudius succeeded, and successive emperors thought it was a game worth the candle. The value in Britain, particularly for Rome, in a resource base, was, first of all, Britain has a lot of stuff that nowhere else has, and in particular, it has minerals. It has gold, it has silver, it has lead. Of course, the Romans are nothing if not great consumers of lead. But in particular, Britain was known throughout the prehistoric world as the place where two metallic elements could be obtained in close proximity. Copper, as we know, the great copper mines of North Wales, and the tin of Cornwall. Copper and tin are important because without both of them, you can't make bronze, and bronze is the key metal before the Roman period. And tin and copper occur together in very, very few places in the world, and Britain is one of them. So that makes Britain supremely valuable. So you can imagine the sort of state functionaries of the Roman Empire are already drawing up a list of what they can get for Britain long before the imperial armies arrive. And of course, Britain is also fertile. It's got sophisticated political culture, it's got coinage, it's got long-term links with Europe. It's got a temperate climate, it's got timber, it's got rivers full of fish, it's got dogs, and it has access to sort of northern things like furs that are particularly interesting for the Romans. So Britain's got a lot going for it, and certainly by the end of the 4th century, Britain is producing a considerable revenue in terms of taxes. There's always been an argument, of course, whether the cost of maintaining Britain with its very expensive northern garrisons around Hadrian's Wall was worth the amount of tax that was received from Britain. Well, it's difficult really to know, how much of the retention of Britain was political vanity and how much was purely resource based. But certainly Britain was regarded as a very important part of the Roman Empire, almost a sort of flagship conquest, partly because of this idea that the Romanization of Britain, this importation into a barbaric, savage land of the idea of a town, very Mediterranean concept, of urban markets, of a judiciary, of regional governors, is an emblem of Rome's, in inverted commas, civilizing influence. The Britons were, as it were, ultra-Roman, and therefore to be held up as an example of Rome's civilizing brilliance. But the Roman Empire is in economic and political turmoil really from the sort of 3rd century onwards. And I'm no Roman historian, and Roman historians will tell you the detail of that. But certainly by the middle of the 4th century, these great country houses, the Roman villas, which we think of as emblematic of the Roman presence in Britain, although of course they're actually a minority elite structure, are not really being built in great numbers. The great mosaics aren't really being commissioned. Civic statuary isn't being, in other words, sort of civic Rome is really in decline. Market town Rome. And a succession of archaeologists have been telling us for 40 years, look, the late Roman town in Britain is already defunct long before the Roman Empire withdraws its governorship of Britain. And of course, because of that wonderful 22 miles of channel that Napoleon couldn't successfully cross, that Hitler couldn't successfully cross, it was relatively easy for a usurper who wanted to set up an alternative imperial force in the West to set up in Britain. There was always a bit of sort of indigenous unrest that might raise a flag for a British Roman emperor. It was relatively straightforward for potential usurpers to take control of Britain, or at least take control of the Roman garrisons and look as though they were ruling Britain. Although in fact that actually only happened once, that there was a sort of independent British state, and that I think was at the beginning of the 3rd century, but don't quote me on that. And in the late 4th century, we get this famous passage from a Roman author called Ammianus Marcellinus that tells us of a great barbarian conspiracy. Hadrian's Wall this is the year 367. Hadrian's Wall is overrun by savages from across the Irish Sea and Picts and people from across the North Sea, as if there's a sort of concerted attempt to overthrow Britain's garrisons. We don't actually know how serious that was. We don't know how serious any sort of violence or anarchy was at the end of the 4th century or beginning of the 5th, when the last Roman garrisons are withdrawn from Britain, partly because the continental sources become much more interested in themselves than they do in Britain. And they were never that interested in Britain. Partly because the archaeology of violence ought to be very detectable. We're talking bodies lying in the streets. We're talking towns destroyed by enemy action. We're talking about wholesale abandonment of settlements. We're talking about fire. We're talking about massive population reduction. And it's pretty difficult archaeologically to detect those in the late 4th century. This is a very long answer, sorry, to a simple,
It's all right.
basic question. And of course, part of that difficulty of visibility is that although historians like to talk about what happens in a decade or in a period of 5 years or even a period of 20 years, by the end of the 4th century, the dating methods that archaeologists rely on are becoming increasingly problematic. The Roman Britain archaeologically is dated by coin that comes over in army pay wagons. Not many coins minted in Britain. And after about 490, almost no Roman coins are arriving in Britain. And to date archaeological layers, we like to have lots of Roman coins in them that tell us a date after which that event happened, the date of the minting of the coin, plus however long it's been in circulation. Once that goes, and once rapid changing fashions in pottery disappear or are no longer obvious, then all the things that archaeologists tend to rely on to date events, collapse of buildings, violent overthrow, they're just simply not available to us. And the real spanner in the works for archaeologists, and this, is the story of the 5th century, is that with the coins gone, the pottery not being very helpful anymore, or at least we can't date it, settlements are difficult to date, burials are difficult to date. And on top of all that, the other magic wand of archaeologists is carbon-14 dating, which relies on all living things containing atmospheric carbon, which itself contains a radioactive isotope that decays at a reasonably constant rate. And by finding out how much of that isotope is left in a piece of wood or a dead body or any organic material, you should be able to date when that item was buried. As it happens, and this may be partly to do with the global turmoil of the 5th century, as it happens, the way in which we scientifically calibrate carbon-14 is against tree ring sequences, which are absolutely accurate. And it turns out that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere generally, which is usually stable, goes haywire in the 5th century. And it then becomes very, very difficult to calibrate our carbon-14 dates. So archaeologists have problems multiplied by problems at just the point where historians stop talking about Britain. So the Dark Ages is a metaphor really for a sort of a double whammy of detection. It's not that the world turns to savagery, it's just we can't see it. We are looking through a glass darkly. So the answer is I can't tell you what happened at the end of the Roman Empire. Except, of course, you fall back on the idea that most people are still living in small farms and villages and settlements like they always were. In other words, life doesn't stop. It's just difficult to watch the process of change happening.
Mm. And I must say, you know, that all that minutiae is why I love this period so much. It is a real kind of detective game almost.
That's why it's so fun.
Absolutely.
That's why we Dark Age archaeologists and historians love it so much, because it is difficult.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's just so, you know, personally, you know, I've most studied the 20th century, and I just love the contrast of immersing myself in this period, because it's just such a different ball game, to use a poor phrase for this period. But do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and yet for me one of the great fascinations and the reasons why I write about this period and try to get other people to be interested in it, apart from the sort of the natural fascination of the mystery, is because when you can say something about the politics of the 5th century, they look very like the politics of the present. In other words, the rules by which power is exercised are the same always, and they happen to be written in fairly straightforward language, as it were, for the 5th century. And I think the 5th century shines a light on the present in a way which is quite unexpected. In some ways, it seems to be a very exotic period, but actually the rules by which power is organized and exercised are the same rules as they are now. They're just easier to see.
Yeah.
In historical terms,
I think one of the fascinating things about history overall for me is the way that human motivations and things like the exercise of power are pretty much uniform, even if there's different ways of expressing it. It's really about the ability of a person or polity to make people behave in a certain way.
Yeah.
Now I think we will return to the archaeology. I think that's inevitable. But I think this is a good time to, before we try and get into any more nitty gritty of when things may or may not have happened, or what was going on in this kind of dark age. We've talked a bit about the archaeology there. Can we talk a little bit about the written sources, which, well, I'll let you explain better than me, Max, but it's quite, well, I think you used a phrase at the start of your book about how we've kind of got almost like autumn leaves that we can piece together, but it doesn't really tell you much. Sorry, you wrote it much nicer than that. But
sounds great. Yeah, well, the amount of new historical information in my lifetime is almost zero. Okay, we've got what we're stuck with. We've lost more than we've got left. There was never much in the first place. I mean, even for the whole of Roman Britain, the actual literary historical evidence is pretty thin. We couldn't construct a political history of Roman Britain in a meaningful sense any more than we could for the 5th century. So the sources the sources I was made familiar with when I became an undergraduate in the early 80s, when archaeology was undergoing a bit of a dark age revolution, but the history had been done to death, or at least that's the way it looked at that time. And the history came in a number of small parts. First of all, there are a number of notices in continental European chronicles that refer to Britain or allude to Britain or tell direct evidence of what's going on in Britain. They are, I mean, I've got a list of them on my screen here, which I put in the book. They're precious thin. Um, we've got entries like there's a chronicle compiled in Gaul in the 450s that says something like the Saxons have taken over Britain. It's not terrifically helpful. Which Saxons? Where? Which bit of Britain? What? So we've got a number of these very, very elusive comments, of which probably the most important are written by churchmen who describe visits to Britain by senior Gaulish clerics, and they probably are the most useful, even if they're infuriating. So there's that set of chronicles. Then there are two documents that purport to have been written in Britain by Britons in the 5th century. One or two other things that may or may not have been, but there are two that are generally accepted to have been written in 5th century Britain. There is a letter of confession which contains a very partial biography by a man we know as Patrick, or Saint Patrick, written sometime in the 5th century, but that's a whole 100 years, and we don't know when in the 5th century Patrick is writing. There are many variations of dates. Patrick, of course, is loaded up with legendary material that's added to his story later, but we do have what purports to be an authentic piece of writing by him. And it tells us where he was born, and it tells us a very little bit about the circumstances of his upbringing, that his father and grandfather held offices in a sort of Roman British or civilian and church government. He doesn't tell us much, but he was captured by slaves at the age of 16, so we know that piracy and slavery are certainly happening in his childhood, whenever that was, and he becomes effectively the first bishop in Ireland, whenever that was, but we don't know. And he may have died in 470 or 490 or at the age of we don't know what. So fascinating and useful. He's an authentic voice, writing in not very good Latin, which is also interesting. But he doesn't tell us anything about political history. Then there's another document, a letter of admonition written by a monk whose name we don't really know, but he's referred to as Gildas. And Gildas provides this fascinating, infuriating, semi-historical summary, a very small part of a huge, I suppose the best way of describing it is a fundamentalist rant against sinners, evil kings, stupid, ignorant people, his fellow Britons. He's a Briton writing in Latin, writing in very, very knobby private school Latin, excoriating the sins of the Britons and how their rejection of the Christian Romans by the 5th century, of course, Christian, and how they cast out the civilizing Christian authority of Rome and allow themselves to become prey through adultery, fornication, sin, drunkenness, all those peccadillos of impious pagan Saxons. And it's Gildas who provides us with our basic set-piece narrative of the legend of the founding of England, Anglo-Saxon England, Britain, whatever you want to call it. It would help if we could date Gildas, because he provides us with a couple of key names. We have almost no names from 5th century Britain, a dozen, maybe 20. He provides us with some key names. He provides us with one key historical incident upon which has been built an enormous industry of fantasy, legendary, pseudo-history, and frankly, a lot of nonsense. And that is this famous Battle of Baden Hill. He doesn't tell us who the protagonists are in that battle. He doesn't give us an Anno Domini date, because Anno Domini dates, AD dates, were not invented till the 6th century and not popularized until the 8th century by Bede. Gildas's narrative is one of civil war, unrest, violence, plague, famine, fire, sword, the whole sort of, and a lot of his narrative is really, strictly speaking, lifted from the more violent pages of the Old Testament. because he sees in the history of Britain leading up to his own lifetime an allegory of the biblical Old Testament. Good kings are rewarded by peace and wealth and goodness, and bad kings rot in hell. How much of his narrative is credible, we don't know. He tells us of a letter written by the Britons to a man called Aegidius, a Roman commander, saying, "Help, help, save us from ourselves." And he tells us that this man had been thrice consul, which ostensibly is very helpful. In fact, it's not very helpful, because no such man called Aegidius or Gidius was in a position to be consul 3 times. So you have to do some sort of mental footwork to come up with the name of Aetius, a great Roman general who was consul 3 times and commander of Roman forces in the West. And then you've got this Battle of Baden Hill, which Gildas helpfully tells us took place around the time of his birth. If only we knew when his birth was. we have some death dates for Gildas, but frankly, they're not very credible, which leads us to the third of the great sort of narratives, really, of the 5th century, which is called the Historia Brittonum, commonly known as Nennius, which is a compilation of all sorts of bits and pieces collected, but crucially not collected till the beginning of the 9th century. In other words, they're dealing with events 400 or 500 years after they purport to have happened. And the Nennian compilation, the Historia Brittonum, and the few other choice pieces in there, purports to tell a story which fleshes Gildas out. It tells us the names of some Germanic commanders who crossed to Britain, Hengist and Horsa. It tells us of some of their battles. It tells us of a British tyrant called Vortigern, whom Gildas mentions as a man called the Superb Tyrant, who made the fatal mistake of inviting the Saxons in, and the Historia Brittonum fleshes that story out. It's also the place where the very, very few mentions of Arthur are contained. A list of 12 battles, a chronography which purports to tell of the year of his death and of Baden Hill. And there's always been a strong temptation to take all of this stuff at face value, partly because Britain's first historian Bede, writing in the 730s, trawled all this material, or much of it, and created a relatively credible but thin narrative for the 5th century. Unfortunately, modern historical scholarship has tended to be very, very skeptical of all this stuff. And the other sort of purported chronological narrative, which we find in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which again is a 9th century compilation written at the court of King Alfred, and which fleshes some of this narrative out with dates. Historians are now pretty cynical about some of this stuff, because most of it looks either completely made up or wishful thinking, or is based on a misinterpretation of the very few sources that are reliable. And out of all that, the archaeologist, who would also be a historian, has to pick a very thin skein of material that might provide the barest outline of a political narrative. And even then, it's a pretty thin narrative.
I remember as an undergraduate, probably similarly trying to pick through these, and you read Gildas, which when I was at university, it was just, oh, here's a web link, it's free online, just have a look at it, and you're just thinking,
yeah.
what am I supposed to do?
You start with Gildas,
with this, because it like you say, in a way, it's the most useful and the least useful of the sources we've got.
Yeah.
Because he is so close to hinting at things. Like he's saying, he gives us a name, but hardly tells us anything about it. Someone like Ambrosius Aurelianus, who we might talk about later. He gives us a battle, but then tells us nothing about it. he gives us the fact, of course, that it happened in the year of his birth, but he doesn't say when he was born, presumably because it was so well known at the time, he didn't feel the need to write it down, because, of course, he wasn't writing for people in the 2020s. He was very much writing for a contemporary audience.
Yeah, he's writing a sermon, and people who write sermons assume that their audience knows exactly what they're talking about. That's the whole point of a sermon, to draw out people's common experience and say, this is why this has happened. This is where you are. You're all sinners, and unless you change your behavior now, you'll all rot in hell. And we all remember, don't we, what happened at the famous Battle of Baden? No need to tell you when, because you all know, blah, blah, blah. Infuriating.
Can I try and pick out something that it might tell us? One thing, and feel free to disagree here, I'm by no means well versed in this period, but Gildas seems to have a very shaky understanding of the Roman past, of what the Roman Empire was. I think he suggests that the Hadrian's Wall was built by the Romans as they left, as a kind of, there you go, Britons, that'll help you to defend yourselves. He doesn't really seem to understand what the empire was. Does that suggest that some of the more, and again, feel free to disagree with me here, some of the more kind of extreme versions of what might have happened in the 5th century, that Roman civilization, in inverted commas, had gone down the pan? If Gildas is writing sometime in the late 5th century, do we think? I think is well, we don't really know, but anyway, at some point.
Yeah.
And the Roman world seems to be a complete mystery to him. Does that suggest that it really, there wasn't much left of what had come before?
It might suggest that Gildas doesn't have access to the sort of political narrative history that we take for granted. From the 18th century onwards, we have historians in this country who are writing continuous political narratives. We're very, very used to the origins of the English Civil War type of historical narrative. Now, it's possible Gildas doesn't have access to that. It's possible that he does, and well, I mean, we could use a modern metaphor and say that there are people who studied history at university. I'm talking about politicians, and I don't need to hint where I'm pointing. People who know quite a lot about history and choose to rhetorically bend that knowledge to their own. That's the whole point of rhetoric, is you cherry pick history for your own purposes. It's possible that Gildas does know something about Hadrian's Wall, but chooses to use it in a metaphorical way, or an allegorical way, just as he uses the Old Testament, in a way that really collapses under scrutiny. Well, we can pick any political speech by a modern politician, and their rhetoric collapses as a sort of factual documentation. So one has to be careful to assume that Gildas is ignorant. I mean, you look at any really very, very ideologically driven preacher, and again, British and Irish history has fairly recent examples of historian politicians who manipulate history for their own ends. Particularly Irish politics is, riven with that in our lifetimes. And against the idea that Gildas knows nothing about Rome is the fact that he is educated in a Roman grammar school, or at least he's educated in an environment of very high functioning literary educational Roman, Latin. So there's a contradiction there. Gildas is, of course, absolutely full of contradiction, and that is one of them. Or it may be that he's brought up as a cleric in a monastic environment, which consciously rejects secular history in favor of biblical history, which must be reliable because it's the word of God and therefore true. That's the way religious rhetoric works. So it doesn't help us with Gildas to say that his Roman history is terrible. It doesn't really get us towards a point where we can reject everything he says. It's absolutely infuriating.
I know, and I think that's one of the. We could literally talk for a whole episode, I think, about Gildas and the different ways of reading it. And I think the other thing that historians have to always bear in mind, and people, when you're thinking about history, especially when we've got so few sources, is, if you picked a sample size of 3 people alive today in Britain and asked them to piece together a narrative of the last 100 years, it would be really shaky. So if we've only got his surviving text, he might not have known that much about secular, like you say, secular history, or might not have wanted to include it in this particular piece of writing. He might have written lots in his career.
And more than that, he doesn't need to, because the Old Testament provides the historical model, and all you have to do is pluck out the allegorical. Bede does it too. He says
that's building on a classical tradition of picking from texts and using the same story with new characters, kind of thing.
Yeah, because it was a tradition that came out of understanding the ancients as authorities. And that's not good enough for us, but it was good enough for Gildas and good enough for his audience. This idea of sort of factual truth in inverted commas is a pretty modern concept. It certainly, it did exist in the ancient world, but I think it's partly a facet of the 5th century. And of course, we don't know how many people like Gildas were writing chronological histories, recording what happened year by year, which was obviously important to Latin clerics because they organized their minds in annual events, annual religious events. And some of the most interesting material purports to be the records of monastic chronicles, recording incidental political details against religious festivals, like when Easter was celebrated, or when there was an earthquake, or when there was a plague of fishes raining from the sky, or when somebody died. These things are frequently entered in annals, and it may be that there are people, that those who take Nennius as a very good narrative history have to assume that there are contemporary 5th century annals that are recording important political events that somehow, garbled as they are, survive into the 9th century. Historians' problem with that is that it could be that what Nennius picks up on, supposing he was called Nennius, are the last few fragments of this independent narrative tradition. But historians are pretty careful about taking that stuff at face value unless they get a bit of corroboration. In other words, you need a bit of sort of cross-referencing between your thin sources. And where you can cross-reference 2 sources that talk about the same thing or the same person, you can go, okay, let's take that as a datum point. And you mentioned earlier Ambrosius Aurelianus. Well, it looks as though Ambrosius Aurelianus is one of those very, very few things that in modern simplistic parlance you might call a fact. There are very few facts in the 5th century. Ambrosius Aurelianus appears to be a fact, a real, true, living, 100% concrete person. Gildas tells us about this man. He's got a clearly Roman name. It's a Roman name with what we would call a Welsh root. The man Ambrosius appears to be Emrys of Welsh legend, who crops up in all sorts of medieval early Welsh texts. And he also appears in the chronography of Nennius, apparently independently. And he looks like he's a genuine fact. But there aren't many others.
So if he is the only person, one of the very few people we can talk about Ambrosius Aurelianus, and he does appear in quite a lot of sources independently, giving that cross kind of collaboration. What can we actually say about him?
Okay, well, first of all, if we could come up with a credible date for Ambrosius, it helps us to give a reasonably credible date for Gildas, because Gildas talks about Ambrosius Aurelianus historically, didn't know the man, not in his lifetime. But he does tell us that Ambrosius Aurelianus was born of the purple In other words, his parents held a rank that would have been a senatorial rank. In other words, a high ranking that implies a functioning Roman or sub-Roman administration. That's, as the name does, of course, Ambrosius Aurelianus is a Latin name, even though it's a Latinized version of what we would think of as a Welsh name, Emrys. Gildas then says he holds out Ambrosius up as a man who picks up the pieces of what's left from a decades of anarchy and chaos in Britain, a civil war, if you like, and fights back against, well, whoever the enemy is, whether it's other Britons or whether it's Anglo-Saxons or whether it's Picts and Irish and Scots. Not always differentiated in Gildas. And therefore he is appears to be a military leader who fights back and achieves some success. And Gildas also tells us that in Gildas's lifetime, basically Britain has been at peace. We get this tremendously contradictory picture. Gildas opens his account with a picture of towns and cities, tall and proud, of fertile fields, a country where you can lay down by a riverbank under trees and sleep comfortably. On the other hand, he paints also a picture of fire, famine, and destruction. So that's not very helpful. But anyway, Ambrosius is said to have fought back against the enemy, multiple enemies possibly, and sort of leads a British fight back up to, well, the era of Bardon Hill, whatever that era is. The additional piece of information Gildas gives us that is slightly helpful. He says that in Ambrosius's grandchildren's day, Gildas's own day, his grandchildren are of inferior stock. In other words, they're not a patch on their grandfather. Okay, well, historians of this period are very used to adding up generations theoretically. So you have to you pick a number for how long a generation is. Okay, and you can pick 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, you know, per any number from that lot. But Gildas knew Ambrosius Aurelianus's grandchildren. Their lives overlap. Well, it's not very helpful if we can't place Ambrosius in 1 or 2 decades. But I think there's a possibility that we can. In amongst all the nonsense in amongst all the uncorroborated material in the Nennian compilation is a section very sexily known as section 66, or the chronography. And since we're here, I'll open it. One of the great things about the 5th century is that all the relevant literary and historical sources we have are all available in cheap, very, very good English translations. So anyone can have a go at this stuff. And if you pick up your copy of Nennius, which I do here, and I look for number 66.
That is one of the things I love about this period is we've got like 3 sources and you just read them and see what you think.
We're incredibly lucky. I mean, most of them are online too. I mean, some of them aren't great translations, but no, we're very lucky. So pretty much at the end of the Historia Brittonum, which is 66 sections before it goes into the wonders of Britain and then a purported annal, we get this extraordinary section. From the beginning of the world to the consulship of Constantinus and Rufus are 5,658 years. Okay, we don't need to worry too much about that, except that it starts with a dating system, which we call the consular dating system. Now, 2 consuls called Constantinus and Rufus were consuls in the year 457. That's a date we can nail, okay? Otherwise, that's not very helpful. But from the consulship of the 2 twins, which we know to be AD 29, till the consulship of Stilicho is 373 years. Okay, so we've got some analytic calculations going on here of the sort that Bede was very good at. And then we get this crucial, I think the most important piece in the whole Nennian thing. From the beginning of the reign of Vortigern, who is often equated with the man that Gildas calls the superb tyrant, who let the Saxons in, from the beginning of the reign of Vortigern to the quarrel between Vitellinus and Ambrosius, here's our man Ambrosius again, are 12 years. And you get this, what looks like a misprint, but of course it's not. That is Wallop, the Battle of Wallop. Vortigern, however, held empire in Britain in the consulship of Theodosius and Valentinian. And in the 4th year of his reign, the English came to Britain in the consulship of Felix and Taurus. Now, for the moment, forgetting what that tells us about politics in the 5th century, the reason I'm inclined to take this seriously is because we know that in the 5th century, nobody would have used a dating system based on Anno Domini dates. Didn't exist, hadn't been thought of. The only 2 forms of dating system that we know might have been used are one, so and such a king ruled for so many years, followed by his son, followed by his son. They're called regnal dates. And if you know the lengths of reigns, you can sort of back calculate. Those things get us into all sorts of trouble because they're rarely very consistent, but you can play with them, you can do the numbers on them. So first of all, what this purports to be is a fragment of an annal that has consular dates on it. And the most likely way in which annals would have been compiled in the 5th century is using consular dates. So immediately, the value of this very small final section of the Historia Britonum is way above anything else in it, because it purports to be of a dating system that is totally credible for that century. Second of all, of course, it gives us some real dates. It gives us a date for the accession of Vortigern of 425 in new money, AD terms. It gives us the name of a battle that happened 12 years after that in 437. The consulship of Theodosius and Valentinian, AD 425, we know that. And then he says, in the 4th year of his reign, in other words, that would be 429, the English came to Britain in the consulship of Felix and Taurus. Okay, so for our purposes, the important thing politically is that the quarrel between Vitellinus and Ambrosius comes 12 years after the accession of Vortigern. To what office, we don't know, but overall governor of Britain, whatever. But that gives us a date for Ambrosius being active militarily in 437 in a civil war. Potentially, that is our fact. It may be the only fact we've got for the 5th century. It's not quite, but it's in the First Kingdom. I've taken this as a datum point. That looks like a good date, in as much as we can have any dates for the 5th century. Now that's potentially a very small bit of gold dust, because of course, if Ambrosius is militarily active in 437, in the 12th year of the reign of Vortigern, that gives us a context of a couple of decades in which political military activity is going on in Britain. And it also potentially gives us an idea of when Gildas is writing. Gildas is writing in the lifetime of Ambrosius's grandsons. Well, add, shall we say, 2 generations to Ambrosius, and you're approaching the end of the 5th century. The traditional date for Gildas is that he died in the middle of the 6th century. So if we take this as reasonable evidence of Gildas's lifetime, we need to put his work, the De Excidio, the ruin of Britain, back into the 5th century. Well, that's big news, as it were, if we could establish that.
One thing, because it allows us to put Baden Hill, which he tells us is 43 years before his writing,
back into the mid 5th century, 450-ish. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I believe as well you say in the book that, I can't remember which scholar, but has really kind of said, if you go back to the very, very earliest, because we don't have Gildas's original text, of course, but we have later copies, and the earliest of those, the writing is somewhat different to the modern translations, and basically implies that Baden Hill is part of Ambrosius's career. Is that, am I right in thinking that?
Oh,
possibly.
It's one of the 2 phrases in Gildas that's the most argued over. Yes, what was there's a way of interpreting Gildas's dating of Baden Hill that is slightly different depending on how you take his very high Latin. I mean, I think you just have to let the scholars get on and argue that themselves. Most of us take it that Bardon Hill happens 44 years before now. And if now is 490, 500, then Bardon Hill is 450 with a decade either side. But when the data 437 suddenly opens up a whole series of possibilities. Bede and the sort of traditional view is that the Anglo-Saxons arrive in the 440s. Bede calls it the adventist saxonym, the arrival of the Saxons. What we appear to be seeing from the chronography and from Gildas is a civil war happening in the 430s. What sort of political context could we place that in? Well, as it happens, we have a totally genuine, real date for something happening in Britain in the year 429. That's 8 years before this conflict between Vitellinus, about whom we know nothing, and Ambrosius. We're told by a perfectly credible continental source that in that year, 429, a Gaulish bishop called Germanus of Auxerre, who's a perfectly reasonable, factual character, visits Britain to help put down the outbreak of a heresy. We won't go into the heresy for the moment unless you want to, but let's say there's a heresy. And he comes across to Britain, wags his finger at the British and says, you're straying from the true path, old chaps. It's about time you got rid of this heresy and followed the true Orthodox Roman form of Christianity. Given the closeness of religious and political leadership and authority and ideology in that period, the chances are if you've got a religious schism in Britain, and it looks like we have, the chances are you've also got a political schism. And Germanus's account, or rather his biographer's account, gives us a little bit of an idea that there's a sort of possibly two parties in Britain, a sort of Roman party and a non-Roman party, which may, of course, partly be a key to unlocking the 5th century. Not that there's a British and Anglo-Saxon party, but there's a pro-Roman and anti-Roman party. That may be a more constructive way of looking at this. And that's the impression we get from Germanus. As it happens, in that same year, a Roman commander called Aetius, and bear in mind the similarity of the name Aetius to the Agidius or Agitius of Gildas, becomes senior Roman commander in the West. And for the first time in probably 20 years, it begins to look as if the emperor may recover imperial authority in Gaul. It's something which historians of the 5th century in Britain have really neglected. Not all of them, but some of them. This idea that Britain's cut off, Rome's gone, it's all over. But if you're in Britain, the last Roman administrators leave in 410. Nobody in Britain necessarily thinks or believes that the Roman Empire is finished. That's not the way people think. I mean, goodness knows, there are people who think the British Empire is still alive. You know, sort of make Britain great again, sort of, you know, there's politics there. And some of that politics may be, things were all right under the Romans, let's go back to the good old days. And there may well be another party that said, God, no, they were terrible. Remember what taxes, they were shocking. So let's imagine that there's a Roman party and an anti-Roman party. And when Aetius is making these huge military advances in Gaul in the late 420s, early 430s, you can imagine a Roman party rubbing their hands together and going, the good old days are coming back, fellas. All we have to do is invite these chaps over and we can go back to where we were before, when we had, you know, good colonial rule from the Romans who understood, you know, the proper way of doing things. It's the law and order party is what we're talking about, a conservative, small c, law and order party. I mean, I'm stretching my narrative to speculation here, but we're just, you know, this is among friends. I can do that.
Yeah, sure.
And the same Aetius becomes consul for the first time in 432. Supposing, anyway, so to go back, Germanus visits Britain again several years later, possibly in the year 437, which of course is the year that this chronography tells us is a civil war between Ambrosius and Vitellinus. So the idea of a civil conflict, civil political religious conflict, dating from the late 420s, when Vortigern comes to power, into the late 430s, almost begins to give us a sense that there is some structure to the story here, particularly because if when Gildas says the Britons wrote to the Romans saying to Aegidius, let's call him Aetius now, thrice consul, well, Aetius had a consulship for the third time in 446, but let's assume that Gildas is misremembering here, doesn't actually have a letter, but he's misremembering, and that this letter is written to the consul Aetius, but possibly during an earlier consulship, i.e. in the 430s, we have a context for Ambrosius and Gildas and a letter written to Rome saying, come and help us. In what looks like a time of civil war in which we may be seeing a pro-Roman, Aetius, come and bring us back into the Roman imperial fold, take us back into the empire, against an anti-Roman faction, saying, God, no. And if that is the case, that we've got a pro-Roman and anti-Roman faction, then that looks as if it may be a more credible background for the arrival of people from across the North Sea, who one party regards as being a breath of fresh air, and another regards as being the antithesis of what good old Roman conservatism looked like. And it may be that those parties eventually become a Western faction, conservative, Roman, Latin, imperial, Christian, and an Eastern faction, anti-Roman, therefore anti-Christian, therefore anti-empire, and possibly pro the bright young things from across the water who speak in a different, more interesting language and have got weapons, good weapons that they know how to use, handy people. I mean, to see a parallel there with modern, shall we say, American politics, I don't think is very difficult. Albeit stretching, political comparisons here. But I mean, if we want to understand the 5th century, we have to understand them in terms of reference that we can get our heads around. And a pro and anti-Roman faction is actually much more, I think, credible than an Anglo-Saxon invasion and British resistance, which is couched in the sort of ethnic nationalistic terms that suited Victorian historians, but I don't think are particularly relevant for the 5th century.
So let's, I want to move into that theme then, about what's kind of more happening on the ground, the kind of migration narrative, this sort of thing, and, how sub-Roman, Romano-British, whatever, becomes Anglo-Saxon in the loosest possible way that we can somehow, it does emerge, it is a reality by the 7th century.
It's an undeniable fact, Alex, that we speak English and not Latin.
Exactly, yeah. and it's interesting as well that when one thing I came to mind, I didn't bring it up, but St. Patrick writing in a funny kind of Latin suggests maybe spoken Latin in the 5th century in Britain.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Linguists call it late spoken vernacular Latin.
Well, yes, okay.
Think of it as sort of Cockney Latin.
Yeah, that's a thought. So let's move, and this is where the archaeology comes in a lot more, I think, isn't it? Because although our sources have a suggestion about, and it's not really till later we hear, people like Bede putting names and dates of Saxons arriving. And although the Civil War picture that you've painted would make sense perhaps for mercenaries, classic late Roman thing of hire some barbarian mercenaries if you're in a bit of a spot. But let's go to the archaeology, I think.
Let's.
What I think is one of the most interesting things Well, there's two things. Let's start with one of them. One of the classic parts of the old traditional narrative of Dark Ages or Saxon invasion is urban collapse. And it's in Gildas as well. The people, I think in one passage, retreat to the hills and forests of Gildas, which does not add up with the world he paints that he's currently living in. But anyway, the classic picture of the 5th century is urban collapse. The great towns, I guess you can't really say cities, but the great towns of Rome and Britain disappear. They fall into ruin. Everyone moves out of them. That's the kind of traditional picture. But I get the impression from your book and from modern archaeology that really over the last 30, 35 years or so, that picture is really beginning to fall apart.
Yes, and it's falling apart for two reasons. One is that where we can archaeologically detect, shall we say, urban decline, and that's a loaded statement anyway, it begins before the end of Roman Britain. As if the British have sort of rather gone off the urban experiment. That could be for all sorts of reasons. But one of those reasons may be that there's an empire-wide trend away from big state cash taxation, what we would call income tax, as it were, tax on wealth, to taxes in kind, which instead of being gathered in coin in great treasury buildings is taken on a more local level. In other words, there's a sort of loss of government taxation or a move away from government taxation to council tax. And council tax, as it were, is collected more in kind. In other words, you turn up at the council building and your taxation is to paint the ceiling of the council chamber or to bring a load of timber to rebuild it, or to bring 6 eggs or whatever, rather than a cash equivalent. And that means that tax becomes local, because if your tax is 6 eggs, you're not going to send 6 eggs to HM Treasury in Whitehall. You take the 6 eggs to the place where they're going to be consumed, which is the nearest person who's going to want to collect the taxes off you and who's going to come and get you if you don't. In other words, the late Roman state seems to shrink from the supranational to the national, to the regional, to the local. And that it seems to happen empire-wide, not just in Britain. And from that, I think a huge number of changes occur organically. And as you know from reading the book, that it's one of my central tenets that the way in which tax is gathered is one of the most important facets of telling us how Britain gets through the 5th century. I think it's a means by which we can trace institutional survival out of the end of the Roman Empire. Now, going back to the towns, like all other settlements, suffer from the problem of lack of visibility. Of all the Roman towns and cities that have been excavated, of course, nearly all of them are our modern towns and cities, with Victorian cellars and huge high rises. You know, we get to excavate keyholes in these things that are very deep, but they're not very broad. And the sorts of things that we would be looking for the 5th century would be very, very easy to see in ground plan, but very difficult to see in section. So first of all, any urban excavation that looks at 5th century archaeology has a hell of a job finding it. Bear in mind, the latest coins they're going to find in those levels are from the 390s. I think I said 490s earlier, the 390s. And so anything after 390 could be of any date until you get to the 8th century. We do know, of course, that in Bede's day, early 8th century, there are no functioning towns in Britain, none, not at all. And not for another couple of hundred years after that. 5th century Britain is not urban in the sense that we would understand having the sorts of things that we think of as you go into town to go to the cinema, that's where the magistrates' court would be, the police station, so on. Those sort of civic functions are no longer in the towns. For Roman historians and archaeologists, that looks like the failure of Rome. So they see it in an entirely negative sense. Things have gone wrong because the magistrate's court is not a magistrate's court anymore. The basilica is not a basilica. The forum is not a forum. There's no market in the forum. So naturally, Roman historians looking forward into that period make it look like failure, abandonment, disaster, and that suits the Gildas narrative of famine, sword, and fire. Wholesale abandonment, bodies lying in the streets. Actually, nobody's ever found any bodies lying in any streets in a Roman town. They're not there. The second thing is that even archaeologists tend to go for the sort of fashionable things they find. There are two big Roman towns, Wroxeter in Shropshire and Silchester in Hampshire, that have never been built over. They're just rural villages or even just fields. And archaeologists have an opportunity to see the end of Rome as a big landscape picture there. When they do that, places like Wroxeter, famously in excavations by Philip Barker, they start to find signs of quite active occupation in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. Not built in stone, although the Roman baths are still standing today in Wroxeter in a field. So they were certainly standing in the 7th century and the 6th century. But things that look rather like Roman buildings, but they're built out of wood. And you extrapolate that to a city like London and ask, would you find such buildings in an excavation underneath a new skyscraper? Not a hope in hell. Okay, so that's a problem of visibility. Most Roman towns have only about 1 or 2% of the Roman, post-Roman levels excavated in them. The most excavated town is archaeologically unfashionable, Leicester. And lo and behold, Leicester shows more signs of occupation in the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries than towns that haven't been dug so much. Okay, so there's a,
you begin to get a pattern.
You begin to get a pattern of actually.
If you excavate 1% of a town, it might just be that street wasn't lived on in that century.
The second thing that we beginning to piece together is one of the things that archaeologists always look at to identify the deposits, the layers, the stratigraphic context after the end of the Roman Empire, is that they find these really quite thick homogeneous layers of soil, which they call dark earth. It's garden soil, it's manure, it's rich black stuff. It's really good for growing things in. And again, for Romanists, that's a sign of abandonment. The Roman towns have abandoned and they accumulate a foot, sometimes 3 feet, sometimes more of this dark soil. Well, I'm an excavator, and my question is, if there's nobody there, where does all that stuff come from? That soil doesn't arrive on its own. And I look at that soil and ask, where's the agency? How is that soil arriving? And then the Romanists would also point to things like the Forum and the Basilica, where instead of magistrates sitting, somebody's dug a hole in the floor and they appear to be reforging scrap metal. Well, for Romanists, that's a sign of the failure of the judicial system. For an excavator, that's a sign of some other agency happening. Why are metals being recycled in the middle of the Roman Forum? And then we find a lot of animal bone in these towns near the old Forum and around some really quite large late Roman buildings. Some of these large Roman buildings, if they were made in wood, would look astonishing like what we know to be the early medieval mead hall of Beowulf. Okay. The stuff going on in these towns, and what that stuff is telling me is that the things that are going on in their towns are local versions of the state happening. In other words, if we can posit this idea that taxation is local, it's based on services and materials in kind, what I think is happening is that these late Roman towns are the centers of what I'm calling petty lordship. And things are coming into those towns, cattle, which are the classic movable, portable taxation in kind, which are being brought into the towns. I think gardening is happening in those towns, which have got walls. They're fantastic places to grow, it's like a walled garden we're talking here. Metalwork is being brought in as a form of taxation and being recycled. And places of assembly are happening in towns which are not like the forum, but they're early medieval equivalents. In other words, what we've got here is evidence of feasting, recycling, centralized taxation on a fairly local scale. In other words, the hinterland of the town, the people, communities are bringing stuff into that place, and it's being recycled, redistributed, and consumed. The thick, dark soil is effectively, you could look at that as a negative. I look at it in an agricultural context. One of the things we know that Norman tax gathering did was it forced peasants to bring their cattle and their sheep to the lord's compound for the winter. And one of the reasons you do that is because the landlord gets the poo, right? Fertilizer is really valuable stuff. And I think one of the things that's accumulating this large amount of soil in towns is basically cattle manure. It's a form of taxation, and it's really valuable. So I think things are going on in these towns that may not look urban, but they're definitely to do with lordship and an elite emerging in the places exactly where you would expect an elite to emerge. And they may be the same people of old British stock who were the magistrates.
And I think
the Roman Empire repurposed themselves as petty lords.
So instead of the town magistrate or the governor or whatever in each town of Roman Britain, instead of them being an agent of the empire, as those connections to the empire fade, they still keep running the local area, they still keep taxing the local area, but they're doing it for themselves.
State has been privatized. Okay.
And actually, one of the best examples of that is Bird Oswald on the Roman Wall.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the few places where archaeologists point to go, oh look, there's the Dark Ages starting. Yeah, where Bird Oswald, a fort on Hadrian's Wall. I mean, a wonderfully atmospheric place if you can ever get there. Where it was excavated by a very good excavator, Tony Wilmot, who was a Romanist but a very enlightened Romanist. And what he found was that the late Roman granaries, which were originally built to store huge amounts of grain brought in by the state to feed the garrison, were repurposed at the end of the 5th century and into the 6th. And instead of being just grain stores, they become part barn, part place for someone to live, the guy who used to be the commander of the garrison, but is now the local lord, the squire, if you like, part places where metal is being recycled, part places where feasting is happening. In other words, and I'm not the first to suggest this, the Mead Hall of Beowulf is a barn conversion coming out of the end of the Roman Empire. Now, if you think in terms of the cataclysmic difference between Roman architecture and Anglo-Saxon architecture, the architecture of the villa and the Mead Hall, all of a sudden, they don't look like a revolution. They look a little bit more like an evolution. And the key to it is understanding how taxation changes and how, exactly as you've said, the great, huge imperial Roman state has become privatized at a much smaller level, and yet is still functioning as an inherited version, as an evolution. And potentially, of course, that evolution doesn't start in 400. It could well start in 350 or 320. In other words, by 400, that process may be quite a long way along the arc.
Which in a way might explain why Britain slips so seemingly easy and without note out of the Roman rule, if it's just been basically running itself for 50, 60 years.
And until the point at which you get this friction that develops, shall we say, in the 420s, between a party that really rather wish, and you could call them, if you like, an aristocratic party, old money, shall we say, the people who did very well out of Rome, who rather wish Rome would come back because they enjoyed the privileges of the local bathhouse. They enjoyed wearing their togas. They liked having their private villa estates. And who really can blame them? And they are the Make Britannia Great Again party, potentially. I mean, again, from Bird Oswald, I'm stretching a narrative into speculation, but I think that's.
But I think one thing it might tell us then about the 5th century and what's happening in Britain that maybe takes away some of the mystery is that this is a long, late Roman empire-wide process. This is of taxation in kind, of much more local authority, of much more church-state authority rather than secularism, of much more, even the army is transformed in the late Roman kind of 4th century into basically the Limitanei, who are just people who live, they're local troops, which doesn't so much need a state.
That's right.
Big state.
Of course, I think it's fair to say that in Gaul particularly, the late Roman institutional state survives in much better shape to be taken over by a Germanic warrior elite than it does in Britain. I mean, we have 5th century churchmen in Gaul, perfectly credible people writing in very, very good Latin, and they're talking as if they're still Roman. Whereas, as you suggest, Gildas's grasp of Roman history and context is thin. So yes, by Gildas's day, I think that process is much, much more advanced in Britain, such that had a Roman invasion happened under Aetius in the 450s, probably he would have been surprised by how un-Roman Britain already was, certainly in the eastern half of the island, possibly less so in the west. And of course, as we know, historically, it looks as though the eastern part of the island changes because of an invasion or migration by Germanic peoples, rather than the other way round, that some of those peoples arrive, if indeed they do in large numbers, into an area that has already decisively rejected its idea of what it thought Rome had been, in favor of this much more localized, privatized, petty lordship. And I, the broad thesis of the book is that there is, if there's a skein of thread that joins the 4th century to the 6th century, when we see a political narrative restart, the thread that you can hang on to, and you yank one end from the 7th century and you pull on it and it pulls on something in the 4th century, is this institution of territorial lordship. That's the institution that seems to run all the way through, evolving as it does. But I think that's the thing that I cling to, that appears to carries the narrative all the way through that 200 years.
Well, that segues us quite nicely into the second. Well, I've chosen these as the 2 big questions of the archaeology. The kind of urban Roman nature of Britain in the 5th century. And then the other big question, which is the Saxon migration. The traditional view, I'll say it again, that thousands or tens of thousands of Anglo-Saxons migrated from northern Germany and Denmark, and in the kind of old view, I would say, basically wipe out the native British people and bring in their English language and their English ways and their English material culture. And again, just as we've said, the kind of story of town abandonment doesn't really hold up. The more and more you look at it, I think the suggestion really from your book and from the last 30 years of archaeology is that story doesn't quite hold up either.
No, but we've got an even bigger paradox in terms of talk of the migration invasion, and that is, as I said before, in the east of Britain our language is English, which is a dialect of Frisian, and in the west and the north, the indigenous languages are Brittonic, which becomes Welsh, and Gaelic, which derives from Irish, and before that Pictish, which is another Brittonic language. And you ask any linguist, any place name expert who looks at the place names of England and sees how very, very few British words survive into English, how very few British place names survive into our landscape, which is essentially a landscape of Anglo-Saxon names or Germanic names, English names. And they go, there is no way any of this can have happened. This huge linguistic shift with almost no British words or syntax or grammar, almost nothing survives without a big displacement of the population. And there are very few linguists who will be prepared to say there might be another way this happened, other than large numbers of people, because that's the language process they see in the modern world from ethnographic anthropology examples. We know that in the early part of the 5th century, from about 420s onwards, we do have what look like quite radically different building structures appear, these so-called sunken featured buildings, the grub huts, if you like, these voids that are sort of below floor cavities in buildings that must really have been timber versions of tents. The first archaeologists to excavate them, of course, thought these were the grub huts of the distressed refugee peasants. It's sort of patronizing asylum seeker view of history. Nobody buys that anymore. You can build a perfectly decent permanent building on top of a hole in the ground, and indeed lots of people did. And then you get the mead hall, this rectangular hall which replaces the stone villa and the other Roman architectural forms, which we've seen actually is actually much less of a revolution than it used to appear. And then the other striking thing, of course, in the archaeology is we've got these cremations that suddenly appear, people being burned on pyres, as they still do in India, their bones and trinkets collected, put in what appears to be a bespoke pottery jar of a type that's completely novel, at least novel in Britain, not novel on the continent, and then reburied. And some of these cremations appear singly, some of them appear with what look like late Roman cremations that don't have any grave goods and are therefore difficult to date. Some of them appear in cemeteries which may have 1,000 of these cremation urns. And I don't think there's any question at all that migration across the Channel happened in both directions, both sides of the end of the Roman Empire. We know that there are Germanic commanders of Roman forces in Britain. We know, as you said earlier, Alex, that there are well-established late Roman examples where warrior tribes under military leadership are shifted around bits of the empire, in the same way that if you wanted to establish a particularly aggressive police force, you wouldn't recruit it from the local area. You'd recruit people who didn't have any local attachments, and they'd be pretty hard on the locals. The last 100 years of Irish history is a very good example of that deliberate use of non-socially integrated military force, which helps to sort of other the local population and dehumanize them. Well, some of that may happen. I mean, there are lots of different versions of what happens in terms of people crossing the Channel from various countries, leading to a Germanic forms of burial, Germanic forms of building, Germanic forms of speech. And I think the point is not that they're all wrong, but that they're probably all right in some measure. There probably were a few pirate enclaves of people carving out little territories for themselves, possibly in Kent, possibly in East Anglia, possibly in Hampshire, maybe. I think small numbers, but possibly. And I think there's a case for some wider, longer term migration. And I think particularly those areas where you find these big cremation cemeteries and big concentrations of these early sunken featured buildings look like places where you could argue that there is a reasonable scale of cross-channel movement of people. When it comes to looking at the detail of that in terms of DNA, modern DNA and modern genetic and modern isotope things, which give you an idea of the chemical traces in people's teeth that they pick up when they're children, there's really very little evidence of mass migration, very little. And occasionally where we find people who are cremated and living in these sunken featured buildings, their isotopes tell us that they were born in Britain.
That was one of the things, sorry to interrupt you, but that really struck me about the book is that, I don't know the science behind it, this kind of isotope analysis, but all the kind of Saxon, inverted commas, sites that are excavated, we don't find any continental Europeans, or so few of them. I just found it fascinating and so difficult to comprehend.
Of course, what those isotopes don't tell you is where your parents came from. So the isotopes looking at second generation immigrants won't find them. Okay, so
which even makes it more complicated.
yeah, and I think over the next 20, 30 years, our understanding of how to interpret that evidence, and of course that evidence will increase in numbers as we spend more money doing it, is unlikely to get us any clearer picture. It's more likely to get us a nuanced mosaic picture. Suffice it to say that there's movement across the channel. Suffice it to say that by Bede's day, as far as Bede is concerned, he knows people who are Latin speakers, British speakers, English speakers, Irish speakers, and Scots and Pictish speakers in Britain. And he cast those in ethnogenic nationalist terms, which I think would be best to ease off on. So I don't for a moment think the picture is simple. What I would say is this, that you ask the following question. Is the picture I see emerging of local lordship, taxation in kind, the emergence of a culture which places a high value on the right to bear weapons, and I use that term advisedly, rather than, if you like, warrior burials in inverted commas, because we don't really think that the people buried with weapons are necessarily warriors, but the right to bear arms, shall we say, which is a marker of rank. I don't think all those characteristics are necessarily predicated on either invasion or immigration. After all, as it's been pointed out many, many times, we may buy our furniture from IKEA, but that does not mean we've been conquered by Sweden in the last 100 years. Any more than drinking Coke means we've been conquered by the Americans, except in an economic sense, or driving Japanese cars means we've been invaded from Japan, except in economic terms. Okay. So what I'm saying is that we have to look at this adoption of ostensibly different culture as a form of display, and we all use forms of display. If I look around me at the roads, I see that the fashion for showing that you can afford a posh car equates to buying a German car. 30 years ago, it was the fashion for buying Japanese cars. And at some point, it might be a fashion for buying British cars, if such a thing is possible. Fashions change, means of display change. I mean, actually, you know, the contemporary news is always full of this stuff that takes you back to the 5th century. You know, it may be that being able to say we buy our furniture and our decorations from John Lewis is a matter of expressing social advantage. In some circumstances, describing yourself as a John Lewis type person might be regarded as a rather poor form. In other words, culture and fashions change. The ways in which we display our identities and behaviors change. And what matters is what you decide is socially advantageous. Now, it may be, for example, that in 20 or 30 years' time, the social advantages of speaking English and adopting all those other forms of English culture, i.e. American culture, English mores, English literature, might kill off Dutch as a language, as a functional, usable language. There are countries around the world that adopt English as their official language, even though almost nobody speaks it, because it is politically, economically, globally, socially advantageous. So what I'm saying is, although I accept that language is a big change, I think there's more than one reason why you change your language. And one may be that it is socially advantageous to talk in a certain way, to bury your people in a certain way, and to, shall we say, have a few handy people around who speak in a foreign language and carry weapons and look like they know how to use them. And it might be socially advantageous to marry your daughter to one of these handsome looking young men who speak German. And it may be then that your grandson ends up speaking a language different from you. And in between, and possibly over 200 years, you know, the English think of themselves as monoglots. We speak English, but nothing else. And we therefore think that basically most people throughout history have only spoken one language. I tend to doubt that. I suspect that in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, there are quite a lot of languages going around. The linguists would say, well, in that case, if that's that period of transition, how come so little Brittonic survives? How little Latin survives? And I can only go back to an earlier argument and say that it might be both socially advantageous to speak Frisian, the origins of English. It might equally be socially disadvantageous to speak Latin. In other words, there might be a reason to deliberately discard Latin at the same time as consciously adopting another language. You know, nationalist sentiment is very good at rejecting something it doesn't like as well as adopting something. And again, looking at the 21st century, it may be that the drive towards indigenous nationalism in the British Isles may drive all sorts of things. I mean, for example, and I think it's fascinating, this, Scots nationalism, which as we know is politically immensely powerful, has not led to any increase in Scottish people speaking Gaelic. I think there are something like 50, 60,000 fluent speakers of Gaelic. Whereas Welsh nationalism, which is politically much, much less powerful, has led over the last 30 years to a very, very widespread adoption or education in the Welsh language, to the extent that certainly anywhere north of Cardiff, most Welsh people speak Welsh. And if I were to move to Wales, I would expect to have to learn Welsh. And I certainly wouldn't get a job in government or in education if I didn't speak Welsh. Now, you can talk about whether, English imperialism and all that, but the fact is you can get very, very different linguistic and cultural outcomes in circumstances that ostensibly you would think might be the other way around. You would expect Scots nationalism to have led to a revival and a pride in Gaelic, but as it happens, Scots nationalists can't be bothered to learn Gaelic, whereas ordinary Welsh people, nationalist or not, learn Welsh. Figure that one out. I mean, these are,
It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I think the thing about the 5th century is to ask lots of those simple questions rather than pretend you can resolve them.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think one of the other things that sprang to mind from stuff I read before, from reading your book, was the idea that, our idea of ethnicity and race and identity is a 19th century really creation based on the creation of the nation state, et cetera, which just was not a reality in the 5th century or insert time period, so that people can slip between identities, ethnicities, in inverted commas, much easier without it being a kind of without it being some sort of national takeover.
That's right. And indeed, one brilliant archaeologist, the late Richard Hall, who excavated much of Viking York, described a period, Viking Age York, and its ethnic and nationalist identity rather beautifully when he said that he suspected that what people had was an innate affinity with ambiguity. In other words, they were perfectly capable of describing themselves as Norse or indigenous as it suited them. And I think actually, if you look at the history of colonialism and immigration in the last 200 years, you do see that. You see this idea of playing ethnic affinities off against each other and adopting which one is expedient at that moment. I mean, again, in Britain now, I mean, I never thought to see this in my lifetime, but the idea you could be described as more or less English or more or less Scottish than somebody else, is, I think, extraordinary in a global and pluralist world, to actually be retrenching into really quite strict rules of which, of course, we've seen in Ireland, that sectarian attitude towards ethnicity and religion and ideology and culture is really telling us quite a lot, I think, about how we might read the 5th century.
I mean, you can only look at how many people across how many places would have described themselves as Roman in the 4th century that would have perhaps looked and sounded and spoke. I mean, the eastern half of the empire spoke Greek, but they would still describe themselves as Roman.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking back to, again, just something that's occurred to me from my time as an undergraduate was the Avars and Slavs happening at a very similar time in Eastern Europe. Traditionally thought these two racial groups move in, these two ethnic groups move off the steppe into Eastern Europe. But maybe it was just the Avars are the ruling class and the Slav is this identity that refers to, because it doesn't really make sense that how much of modern Europe is Slavic couldn't have come from one tribe moving in. You know, it's
That's
more
right.
an identity
That's
that
right.
spreads.
One interpretation of Bede and Gildas and a lot of apparently pejorative terms for British. So the English term Welsh derives from a word that effectively can be used to mean a slave or a subjugated person. And from that idea, and from a number of entries in annals and law codes, it's always been thought that the Anglo-Saxons suppressed and oppressed the native British population. And I have to say, I don't really buy any of that. I think it's just as possible that that pejorative sense of an indigenous British-speaking person may have arisen out of a class divide that already exists, and that's a convenient way of couching it. You know, I think you have to, you know, clearly there are sensitivities in these arguments that are very, very live today. And I think one of the great values of looking at history is both that the present casts a light on history, but that also history shines light on the present. And both teach us to be very, very careful of making big pronouncements. You know, I've speculated about a political history of the first half of the 5th century, but I wouldn't put my life on it. And I'd be very open to say, I'm speculating here from a very small amount of material that's reliable. And I think people are very quick, both historically and contemporaneously, to make big value judgments, you know, to generalize from the specific in a way which is, you know, clearly intellectually suspect, which is going to bring us round and about to the A word, isn't it? Shortly.
Well, we can do. I want to say one more thing then, if I can try and, because I know we're speculating, and that's the fun, I think, of the 5th century. We can speculate, and you know, I look forward to other interviews where I think we're going to get a different picture, and I think that's the brilliant thing about this time period. So I just wanted to kind of put a bow on the immigration and the archaeology behind it. I think the picture that I get from what you've said today and what you've written is that, you know, the stories in Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of mercenaries and pirates who come over and settle and conquer might be based on basically legends passed down based on a small number of individuals, pirate bands, or people who were hired as mercenaries who made a name for themselves, but that ultimately what happens in the eastern half of Britain is much more a kind of cultural osmosis shift, re-identification. And actually, you should never bring in a new point in your conclusion, but I've heard it said that maybe that people in the eastern half of the Britain already spoke a Germanic language. Or is that nonsense?
Yeah, this derives from a very influential piece of work that came out, well, I guess it's it's a few years ago now, by Stephen Oppenheimer, The Origins of the British, in which, I mean, he's a DNA specialist, and he was writing at a time when DNA was the big thing, and it would solve the problem of was there a migration, wasn't there? It hasn't, not yet anyway. Like all these scientific disciplines, DNA tracing is very complex and nuanced. There is a very strong temptation to think, well, one possible reason for Germanic languages to be picked up so homogeneously over the eastern part of Britain, in other words, Northumbrian and Wessex English are not that different. You know, English is a very homogeneous language, or I might mean homogeneous. And one of the possibilities of that is that the displacement of British and Latin has begun long before 400. And it's a very attractive idea. And part of that comes from a sort of speculation that the North Sea was a trading area in which people on both sides of the North Sea perhaps had more in common with each other than Britain did with the rest of the Roman Empire. And it's certainly true, of course, that there are strong cultural affinities between Scandinavia and Britain and the Low Countries, no question about that. And that as a trading area, they operate in circular fashion anyway. English, of course, is a Frisian dialect, and the Frisians were the great traders, even down to Bede's day. And there's a strong temptation to think that there is a sort of Germanic lingua franca doing the rounds of the east coast of Britain in the 5th century. It's a very attractive hypothesis, and I would love to put a fiver on it. I think I'm only going to put about 20p on it, because linguists don't find any evidence of that language mixing early on. Again, part of their argument is, so why has it displaced all the Brittonic elements? It's a really attractive hypothesis. And of course, another branch of that is the idea that Roman military commanders from the German areas are bringing in Germanic, but they're very, very small numbers. It's really attractive hypothesis, and I wish there was some evidence for it, but there isn't. One of the elements of that is somebody had a theory a long time ago that there was some evidence for a little bit of Germanic creeping into very small amounts of Brittonic in Iron Age coinage. Don't put that to a linguist; they'll rubbish that one very quickly. Sadly, there's.
So basically, it's an open book, more or less, other than we can rule out a few things.
Yeah, there are a few things can be ruled out, but mostly the fun of the 5th century is it's pretty difficult to rule anything out.
Yeah, and I did think actually one of the interesting, I keep saying that, but I'll say it again. One of the interesting things was that the archaeology just finds none of the violence. We don't find battles. We don't find ruined towns. We don't find even people who've been killed in battle or murdered. Even the warrior burials of the Saxons don't really show any combat.
It's a much trotted out fact amongst archaeologists that forensic pathologists, i.e. the CSI people who deal with 5th century bodies, still find that in the early Anglo-Saxon period, the possible incidence of weapon blade injury, which is the only real way of detecting violence, is about somewhere between 1.5% and 2%. Now, of course, you can die in battle without there being a weapon blade injury that shows up on your bone anatomy. It's pretty thin stuff. I mean, if you look at the coroner's records from the 13th century, you see a lot of violent death, most of it from falling into vats of boiling water or one family member beating another family member over the head. In other words, domestic violence, which I'm sure is rife. It's warfare is really hard to detect. We don't have the absolutely sure sites of many early medieval battles. I'm struggling to think of any. And I get a huge inbox of people saying they have conclusively identified the site of such and such a battle, whether it's Baden Hill or Brunanburh or any number of other battles. And would I like to comment? And the answer is no, I wouldn't really. What I always say is, give me some weapon blade injuries on skeletons and we can start talking about it, but nah. But the hills in this place are exactly like the hills described in Nennius. It's a hill, isn't it?
400 years later, yeah.
I mean, one of the things we can say is that lots of early medieval battles were fought at river crossings on Roman roads. That we can say.
Which, of course, suggests
how many people died.
But they suggest something about the kind of legacy of Rome as well.
They also suggest something about how ritualized violence was. I mean, I'm perfectly prepared to believe that people squared off with one another very frequently, and I'm perfectly prepared to believe that people got killed, and violently so. But I think a lot of the ritualized battle is probably just that. In other words, quite a lot of shouting and quite a lot of display and quite a lot of shield beating and possibly not many dead.
Well, yeah, and I think that's something that I've always been kind of trying to think about and square my head around is that kind of quite a lot, I think the vast majority of battles, even up to, the 17th century, do not look like what we think they look like in films and things like that. It's mostly just basically a game of confidence of which side is going to bottle it and run, and then rather than big armies going, smashing together.
That's right. None of which is to say that 5th century lordship is not thuggish and brutally nasty. So, let's not romanticize it. None of it's nice.
No.
But for the most part, most people go about their business. And there is one absolutely salutary fact about the early medieval period, i.e. the period between 400 and 600, is that archaeologists, to my knowledge, have never identified one single contemporary settlement that's got a wall around it or a palisade or any form of defense. Now, it is true to say that some Iron Age hill forts are reoccupied in the 5th and 6th centuries, and some of those defences are refurbished, the most famous one being South Cadbury, which has, of course, its supposed Arthurian associations. But in the lowlands, none of the royal sites, Yevering, Cheddar, none of the settlement sites, Mucking, West Heslerton, West Stowe, none of them have any defences at all. In other words, their lives were not ruled by the imminent threat of extreme violence from armed parties. Just no evidence at all.
Which kind of takes us back to Gildas's vision of a country where you could lie down beside the river and kind of wind your evening away. But
well, it's a sort of Blakean Jerusalem, what he's describing, at the same time as telling us, as Blake was, that there's all this, the dark satanic mills go with the leafy countryside and the babbling brook. Now, that's, of course, a function of human society. They are not mutually exclusive.
Indeed. Well, let's go then to
let's come on. We got to tackle Arthur.
Our A word. It's in the title of your book. He doesn't come up very often. Now, I think in the again, I don't want to generalize here, but let's say around about the 1970s, scholars, quite a few of them, John Morris published a series of studies of the primary sources, very serious scholar. And you could say quite confidently that King Arthur, whoever he was, I mean, it's quite funny how little he can. Again, I'm not trying to belittle him here, but he can't really tell us anything about him. But he writes several chapters about his empire and how important he was, without giving us any detail whatsoever on him or his career. But anyway, King Arthur is obviously the one figure that the man on the street, whoever he is, could tell you about this period, or it's certainly the element that captures the imagination, let's say, about this period of this legendary figure who was some sort of Romano-British warlord, king, defeated the Saxons, associated with Baden Hill. I always kind of think, if we've got one person whose name begins with A, maybe just that person, Ambrosius and Aurelius. But anyway, what, if anything at all, can we say about Arthur?
I mean, I've got the shelf full of the books. You can say, the great thing about Arthur, of course, you can say pretty much whatever you like. First of all, as an early medievalist, I'm going to completely discount Geoffrey of Monmouth. Okay, so the Camelot, Guinevere, Galahad stuff, unhistorical. Period. End of story. Now, I might conceivably be doing Geoffrey of Monmouth an injustice, and he may have had the sources that he claims were ancient and that he lost or whatever. I'm not buying any of it. We're talking 700-800 years after any supposed events. No. So forget Geoffrey of Monmouth and all that stuff, which I'm calling stuff. Forget King Arthur. There
was no sword in a stone.
Well, the sword in the stone is an interesting concept for another reason. Because the sword in the stone is I think, and again, I'm not the first to point this out, a relic of Bronze Age metalworking technology, where you pour liquid bronze into a stone mold, and what comes out of it is the sword.
Well, there we go. I didn't know
nothing to do with Arthur or any other Arthur. Okay, let's tackle Arthur head on. Okay, we've got the Nennian stuff, which is a list of 12 battles. Then Arthur fought against them in those days, and he fought 6 battles on the river, what have you, and so on. I mean, I've taken my turn at writing that stuff and trying to eke it out. The best one was Leslie Alcock, who was both an archaeologist who excavated at South Cadbury and a very credible academic thinker. Towards the end of his career, he as it were, renounced Arthur, became what we would call a reductionist. In other words, he went back to saying, what can you actually say? And found that you could say almost nothing. The problem I have with Arthur, and the reason I've sort of written him out of the First Kingdom, is actually a quite simple one. Tom Holland wrote a review of the First Kingdom in which he said that I didn't appear to be interested in Arthur. And I think what he failed to notice is I very explicitly explain in the book why I have pretty much bypassed Arthur. And there's a very functional reason why I've done that. I'm not for a moment saying that Arthur was definitely an unhistorical made-up figure. I don't know. And he might well have been a real historical figure. And if there wasn't an Arthur, there were Arthurs, there were independent military commanders knocking around in the 5th century. I'm sure Ambrosius Aurelianus seems to be one of them. Vortigern may be another. Vitellinus may be another. Hengist and Horsa, those people are probably quite likely. I don't, you look at the Balkans in the 1980s after Tito falls from power, and suddenly all these warlords emerge from nowhere and become hugely powerful, very, very thuggish characters quite quickly, with huge followings. So let's not discount the possibility of an Arthur, or indeed Arthur. My problem with Arthur is this. The thing that, as I've said before, the skein of thread that leads us from the late Roman Britain into Bedean Anglo-Saxon England is an institution that I'm calling territorial lordship. A person finds, wins, marries, fights for the right to control the resources, the surplus that can be taken off a parcel of land whose extent he knows, or indeed she knows. That is to say, somebody occupying a central place, which could be Birdoswald, it could be Londinium, it could be Wroxeter, it could be Rendlesham in Suffolk, it could be the remains of a villa, farm complex, all these things, or it could be an old Iron Age hill fort, a central place into which the produce, the surplus of the surrounding countryside, which acknowledges your right to do it, comes to you and you consume it. It's not a market economy, it's a consumption distribution economy. People have often said to me, well, why would people put up with that? Why would they voluntarily bring their stuff in? Well, their answer is, we must understand taxation as something that we try and avoid. We try and avoid it because we don't see what we get out of it, which is actually, not true. We get buses and swimming pools and an army, whether we want one or not, and a health service. That's what we get. When your taxation and your tie to the consumer is much closer, in other words, the lord involved, there's a much better reason for buying into that system. One is that you'll get some of it back. Beowulf tells us that. Stuff is brought into the mead hall and there's a feast and you're invited to the feast. So you get to consume part of your taxation anyway, just as I get the right to go to my swimming pool and use my library and use the health service for free, and use the roads and so on. So you get some of it back. Second of all, you get to belong to that lord. And knowing to whom you belong is very important in the early medieval period. That much is absolutely obvious. Indeed, I've often thought that probably if you met somebody, the first thing you would ask them was not what their name was, but who their lord was. Just as in Ireland, even today, first thing people want to know about you is your surname. Who is your daddy? Who is your granddaddy? That way they can place you in their social, political, historical context. Who do you belong to? Okay. Well, you belong to the person to whom you pay those taxes in kind, and furthermore, that's a patronage network, and the patronage network works two ways. First of all, your children are much more likely to benefit from that relationship because there's a bond of dual loyalty. So it may be that your son or your daughter may go into service for that person, and that buys you into part of that system. In the end, you get a quite complex web of interdependencies. Now, by the time those things come into the really solid historical geography, they are territorial units of a size that we would now call the township or the parish. So the places that appear in Doomsday are the last remnants of a unit of territorial lordship. So we appear to be getting away from Arthur, but we're not. That's the history of this country, is the history of the geography of power at a small scale, takes you through from the Iron Age, through the Roman period, into the early medieval, and into Doomsday and beyond. It evolves, but essentially, that's how power is mapped onto landscape. It's mapped in local taxation. And I go into great detail in the book about the mechanics of how that works. Okay. Sub-question 2b, as it were. What does Arthur, supposing we know anything about him, tell us about the exercise of territorial lordship in the 5th century? Answer, nothing. Why? Because Arthur doesn't have a geography. His battles, if they're real, appear to be conducted all over Britain. In the earliest sources, he doesn't have a Camelot. He doesn't have anywhere. He doesn't have anywhere that we could say this was his manor, as it were. And if what little we can say about him is that he's a military commander with a portfolio that takes him all over Britain, well, then he doesn't fit into any medieval pattern of lordship at all. He's a Roman military commander with a brief, a mobile brief. And that's the most we can say about him. So the biggest thing we can say about Arthur is a negative. He tells us nothing about the exercise of territorial lordship. He has no local geography. He has no regional geography. We can't place him in East Anglia or the Anglo-Scottish border or London. There's no context for him at all. He has less context than Ambrosius. So if I want to understand territorial lordship as a way of getting us through the 5th century, he brings nothing to the party. And that's why, from a book writing narrative point of view, I've had to effectively put him in a footnote. Of course, I understand that my publisher likes to have the A word on the cover of the book because it situates people. It is the Age of Arthur. John Morris was absolutely right to call it the Age of Arthur because it's a good moniker. Who else's age do we call it? Gildas's age? Not great. The Age of Bede we can talk about, early 8th century. The Age of the Saints we can talk about. Age of Arthur is like the Dark Ages. It's just a convenient popular term for a period that doesn't have an otherwise clear narrative focus. But if I'm right in that the way through it is to understand territorial lordship at the level of the squire, at the level of the tribal chieftain, at the level of maybe even kingship, Arthur doesn't bring anything to that party at all. If you could place Arthur on Hadrian's Wall in Burd Oswald, Roman fort, in AD 420, then we'd be getting somewhere, but you can't. You can place someone who's an equivalent of Arthur maybe there, but so it's you know, I suppose the only thing I can say to the great readership of Arthurian persons on the street is sorry, sorry, but you know, I think there's a more interesting story to tell, actually, and Arthur doesn't bring much to it.
I think I have to agree, and I think you have told it very well in your book, and we will link the First Kingdom in the episode description. And you know, it certainly comes with my recommendation, because as I think I've said too many times already in this episode, the really interesting thing you talk about is, but you know, there is so many things that kind of are surprising or enlightening about the 5th century, and I hope our listeners have got some of that from our discussion, and have probably, I hope as well, got a sense of the real excitement really in the historiography of this period, the way that it can be interpreted so many ways, the way that evidence has to be pieced together and interpreted.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried both to accept the fact that most of the evidence we've got historically is about kings and queens and lordship, but also to try and give that a context which allows us to put real people in a real landscape with quacking ducks and smelly poo and the sorts of problems that people need to solve to get through life. So, you know, what do people do day by day? Well, we know from the fact they drop their weaving equipment that they're spending an awful lot of time spinning and weaving. We know a lot of what they get up to. They make pottery and they build lots of buildings, and they're highly competent craftspeople. You know, if I've often said this, but if I want to really evoke a period of history about which we know nothing, and which is really about people getting by through good times and bad, much like our own, the best thing you can do is look at a mid 16th century townscape painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, and you see people just doing stuff and him observing them. And if the 5th century had a Bruegel, some of those people would be very eccentric. And some of them would be playing games, children would be mucking around, getting up to no good, merchants would be doing their stuff, lords would be doing their stuff, and people would be getting by, getting drunk, having parties, dancing, telling stories, gossiping, stuff that people do. You know, people are people. And I very, very much doubt, despite the lack of evidence, that people weren't doing that stuff in the year 410 and 480 and 550, because that's how people get by. And that's what makes people human, and what makes history interesting. Because it's sort of a foreign country, and yet you feel you could visit it and go, oh, okay. Who's the nearest lord that I need to go and talk to? You know, how would a time traveler navigate their way through the 5th century? The answer is, you'd say, take me to your lord, and you work it out from there.
And it would be, imagine if you struck looking, oh, it's Arthur down the road.
Yeah, well,
yeah, probably more likely Ambrosius, but there we are. Thank you so much, Max. I hope you can tell I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you have too.
Well, no, it's great fun talking about it, because, you know, the writing process is pretty self-absorbed, and it's great to do that thinking out loud by talking to someone who's, you know, has a pretty good idea of really good questions to ask, and that's really good. Most enjoyable.
Thanks, Max. Peter.
All right. Well, thanks to Max. It's been a really fascinating, enlightening conversation. And from us here at History's Most, I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex, and thanks for listening.